I need my, my clicker. Ah, here it is. Okay, thank you, Bob, and thank you especially for inviting me and for doing a program on addiction, because this is probably one of our major public health problems, both in this country and certainly globally. And it's a problem that, as I'll tell you, starts in childhood and adolescence. And one of the scary things about addiction is that you don't know ahead of time if you're vulnerable or not. About 10% of people can stop. Once they try drugs, they can experiment with drugs, and then they can stop. But you don't know if you're among the 10%. And so this is a really important thing. You don't want to do that experiment. And so what I'd like to do is just describe some of the work we've done at Brookhaven National Laboratory in developing tools that we could actually image the human brain, image the brain of the addict, image the movement of drugs in the brain, to see if we could find out more about what is it that's going on that makes some of these substances so powerfully addictive. And so when we talk about addiction, it's a complex problem. You have not only the effect of the drug on the brain, but you also have biology and genetics. We've all heard of families of alcoholics. If there's a first-degree relative, like a father who's an alcoholic, there's a high probability that the offspring will be alcoholic. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be alcoholic, but there's a high probability. So there's a vulnerability associated with your biology and your genes. There's also environmental effects. You can train animals to self-administer drugs, but you can train them much more easily if you put them in a stressful environment. So all of these play into this disease called addiction. And by addiction, I don't mean how much of a drug one takes. I mean this loss of control. It can be the cigarette smoker that can't stop smoking even if they've had a surgery for lung cancer, or the cocaine addict who can't stop taking the drug even though the drug is no longer pleasurable, even though they've lost their job and their family. So this is what we want to find some more about. And what we've done at Brookhaven National Laboratory, what I and my colleagues have done, have worked out various imaging tools. And not too much on the technology here, but just suffice it to say, we label organic molecules and drugs with isotopes like carbon-11. It's an isotope of carbon that has a very short half-life. You can substitute it for a normal carbon in a drug, and that allows you to make an image with a PET scanner. This all starts with a cyclotron. It's a big accelerator that can make these short-lived isotopes. It requires chemistry. So addiction is really a developmental disease. And what this plot is showing you is the age at which most people start experimenting with tobacco, with marijuana, and with alcohol. You can see this is very, very young. And it's also at an age where the brain is developing and the brain is very vulnerable at this age. Now, when we talk about addiction, you've probably heard of dopamine. Dopamine is a natural, what we call a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that's made in the brain, and it's associated with movement. When you lose the cells that make dopamine, you can get Parkinson's disease. So dopamine is associated with movement. It's associated with risk-taking behavior. It's associated with addiction. And it's also associated with feelings of well-being. So one of the things about drugs and drugs of abuse is that all drugs that are abused by humans elevate dopamine. And they don't just elevate it a little bit. They elevate it very intensely, very rapidly in the brain. Now, what's very interesting about this is that no matter what the drug is, whether it's nicotine or heroin or marijuana or cocaine or alcohol, all of these drugs elevate dopamine in this one little part of the brain called the reward center. Now, this reward center is crucial. It keeps us eating. It keeps us reproducing. It's the thing that makes us look forward and to expect things that are pleasurable. Now, dopamine is interesting because it's also elevated in feelings of well-being. It's also elevated by natural reinforcers like highly palatable food. Now, the difference is that the intensity of the rewarding experience is much, much greater with the drug. So what I've shown you here is this a crude diagram of the brain. So if you slice my brain like this, back of the brain, front of the brain, there are little groups of cells deep in the brain that produce dopamine. And then the cells send the dopamine to what's called the nucleus accumbens, or the reward center, and also to the frontal cortex. Now, what's important about this is that these parts of the brain have different functions. The reward center is the reward center. It's the center of pleasure and reward. The frontal cortex, it's the part of the brain that kind of lies right over the eyes. It is the inhibitory control, or the executive control center of the brain. It allows you to anticipate consequences of doing something. And in fact, it's a part of the brain that matures very slowly. You don't get a mature frontal cortex till you're in your early 20s. So psychiatrists and psychologists will sometimes say that for a young person, for a child, the parent is the frontal cortex. The parent puts the brakes on behavior. So this is a crucial part of the brain. So in an animal, you can actually put a probe, say, into a rat's brain and sample how much dopamine is released with different stimulations. For example, if you show a rat food, especially highly palatable food, they'll elevate dopamine a little bit, a little 50% blip here. If you give the rat amphetamine, it'll elevate dopamine by 1,100%. So if you equate dopamine with reward and pleasure, you can see how the natural reinforcer loses and the drug of abuse wins this race. And so you can actually give a cage of rats free access to cocaine. They'll lever press for the cocaine. You come back in a few days and they'll be dead. And they'll be dead because they don't do anything else. They don't stop to eat or groom. Cocaine is different than most drugs. So that kind of powerful thing stimulated us to want to learn more about this. So what we do is, I'm going to show you images, so I want to show you the anatomy that goes with it. So you can slice the brain like this, and you get this kind of a picture. And here, again, are the cells that produce dopamine. Here's your reward center, and here's your frontal cortex. And then if you home in on the cell, so the cell fires, this dopamine cell here fires. It releases dopamine. Dopamine binds to receptor, which is these blue elements. So it's that binding of the dopamine to the receptor that transmits a signal. And then along this cell, there are all kinds of control points, because you don't want too much dopamine, you don't want too little dopamine. So there's this red protein here is an reuptake site that brings the dopamine back up and stores it. And these are enzymes that break it down. And so what we've done is develop radio tracers that allow us to image these various parts of the cell. So we can ask the question, does the drug of abuse change this part of the cell or that part of the cell, and learn more about addiction in the process. For example, if we want to image the transporter, we put a C11 on the cocaine molecule. And we are able to give these to humans because we can make very tiny quantities of this that don't cause a behavioral effect, but allow us to actually image where this is in the brain. And you see this very nice image here of the human brain. If we want to look at these receptors, we have another molecule that gives this image. If we want to look at the whole brain activity, we have a sugar molecule, which allows us to look at the whole function of the brain. And if we want to look at the enzymes which break down dopamine, we have other labeled compounds. So I'm going to show you some of the results with some of these. Now, our studies in,
Joanna?
yes?
That thing you're wearing on your chest is apparently putting hum in our
Oh, okay, that's,
Is that causing a problem?
I think, yeah, Ralph, this is,
Okay,
I'll talk extra loud,
okay.
Ralph, okay?
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm sorry. So our studies of addiction started with Nora Volkoff, who came to Brookhaven National Lab in the late 80s. She's a psychiatrist. She's now head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She had been studying cocaine abusers at the University of Texas. In the emergency room, they would come in with stroke-like behavior, and she noticed their brains had big holes in them. And it's because cocaine is what they call vasoactive. It constricts blood vessels, causes little stroke-like activity in the brain. And so she didn't want to study that per se, but she wanted to know, why do people take drugs? What is it so powerful about cocaine that causes people to keep taking the drug even though they have problems like that? So the way cocaine works, it's kind of a simple-minded picture. The normal dopamine cell fires, dopamine's released, it binds to a receptor. This is kind of the normal thing. The dopamine gets picked back up. The concentration is pretty well regulated. What cocaine and also what Ritalin do, both of these block the dopamine transporter, so that when the cell fires, dopamine builds up, stimulates that receptor. You get a big signal, which we think is what causes the euphoria from cocaine. But then when you need to clear it out, the mechanism for clearing it out is gone, because the cocaine is essentially like it's blocking the door. And so this is the mechanism. And we asked the question, if you could image where cocaine goes in the brain, could you learn anything about why it's so powerfully reinforcing? So we put a carbon-11 on the cocaine molecule, and these are slices of the brain from the top of the brain to the base of the skull, as if you kind of slice my brain up like a loaf of bread. And you can see it's a rainbow scale, so where the cocaine is stuck in the brain is right in this part of the brain that contains the reward center. See these red areas? Very nicely, very localized there. And so when we did these images, what we learned is a huge amount of cocaine gets into the brain. Now, drugs that get into the brain can get into the brain in different degrees. Different amounts can get in. This cocaine molecule is almost designed to hit the brain, and to hit it very, very strongly. So a huge amount gets in the brain, and it gets into the reward center. But that wasn't the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is if we sit on the one slice that really contains the reward center and look at it through time. So these are minutes, 1 minute, 3, 5, 10, 19, 29. So this is through an hour. It gets to the brain very, very rapidly. This is a lot of drugs get to the brain slowly. This is one of the fastest ones we've seen. Peaks around 5 minutes, but by a half an hour, it's gone. It gets into that brain extremely fast, and it leaves also very fast, also very unusual. So we did these studies where there wasn't a behavioral effect, but we said, how does the time course of the high from cocaine go in a cocaine abuser? And people had measured this in the laboratory. So we plotted their data along with ours. So this is time, and this is percent of the peak uptake plotted against percent of the high we got from the literature. And they almost perfectly parallel one another. The high comes on very rapidly. The high goes away very rapidly. The person remembers the high from cocaine, very pleasurable. They have more cocaine, they take it again, they take it again, they take it again, in a binge-like pattern until either the cocaine is gone or they're exhausted. And so what this tells us, and it's just an image of a lesson that has been known for quite a while, is how fast a drug gets into the brain plays a really key role in whether or not it's reinforcing. And smoking and IV injection are the most rapid ways to get drugs into the brain. So and you can think of just a cigarette, a nicotine patch or gum doesn't usually work very well for smoking cessation. It doesn't replace that cigarette. That cigarette gives that instant mood-altering effect that you need when in reinforcement. So smoking and intravenous injections are the most likely to result in addiction. So one of the things that we were doing at the same time was actually looking at the brain of the cocaine abuser. And these were studies done in the late 80s with people who were in a rehab center for 3 months in the VA hospital in Northport on Long Island. And what we started looking at was the dopamine receptors, because we thought that's probably the most likely to be the thing that's really changed in the brain of the addicted person. And this is a plot of dopamine receptor levels and age. Turns out you lose your dopamine receptors as you age. Just normal, healthy aging, you lose about 40% of the dopamine receptors and dopamine cells. So we always have to regress with age. And we never find cocaine abusers much more than the age of 45. And so if you look, these are people who aren't abusing in magenta, and the cocaine abusers are in green. There's huge variability, but on average, the cocaine abusers have lower levels of dopamine receptors than people who aren't using drugs. And then we went on to look at other kinds of addiction, and I'm just showing you the images because it's easier to show an image than to show a bunch of numbers. We went on, the second thing we looked at was alcoholics. These are the control population. Again, we have a rainbow scale. So the addicted individuals are in this column. So this is the images for the cocaine abusers. Lower dopamine receptors. Methamphetamine abusers have very low dopamine receptors, actually the lowest, the most damaged brains that we've seen in all of the addictions we've looked at. The alcoholics also have lower dopamine receptors. Heroin abusers also have lower dopamine receptors. And in fact, one of the physicians in our group, Jean-Jacques Wang, said, you know, in the obese person or the pathological overeating person, you have some of the same kinds of behavior. The person can't stop eating even though they've got health problems from obesity. So he said, let's look at the receptors of obese individuals. And so he studied a series of obese people, and sure enough, the dopamine receptors were much lower in the obese individual than in the normal weight individual, and it went, how low they were was in proportion to their body mass. So Jean-Jacques has been doing a lot of studies on the interactions between the brain and the stomach. You know, do the signals of being full, are they different in the obese individual than in the normal weight individual? So what we think is that in addiction, the model that we're kind of developing is that in the addicted person, you have low reward stimulation. So it's an understimulated reward system, and the person is taking the drugs to feel sort of normal, to get a sense of well-being. And so picture this normal person, lots of dopamine receptor, the cell fires, they bind, you get a nice stimulation of the reward circuits with natural reinforcers like food. In the addicted individual, you have fewer dopamine receptors. And so what we have here is a situation where we have, let me see. I missed the slide, but what we also have going on here is we've learned that the frontal cortex of the brain is also lower in the addicted person. So not only do you have this drive to take the drug, but you also don't have that inhibitory control. So picture this is your frontal cortex. Normal, non-addicted brain, you have good control over that behavior. You can resist eating the third chocolate chip cookie or whatever else your problem is because your frontal cortex tells you to stop. So what happens in the addicted brain is you really want that chocolate chip cookie. It's eating at you. You really need it, and you don't have the frontal cortex control. And therefore, you set this whole circuit into motion, and rather than saying stop, it says go. And not only that, say you have a stressor here, you remember how good that tastes. So you've got all of these things going on and no frontal cortex to put the stop circuit on or to put the brakes on the behavior. So one of the things that we asked was if you could magically increase these receptors, could you change addictive behavior? And we don't know how to do that in humans, but you can do that in a rat. So Peter Thanos in our group had a group of alcohol-drinking rats. So he had a behavior that he could look at. So what he did is he implanted via a virus the gene that makes dopamine receptors into the reward center of this rat. So if you wait about 4 days, you get extra dopamine receptors, and they wear off in about a week. And so he then looked at the alcohol intake of these rats, and the alcohol intake almost completely stopped with the extra receptors. So if there was some way, if we could figure out how to improve the dopamine system in addicted people, I think we would have the ability to try to bring that control up. So we've also been interested in the biology and genetic aspects of addiction. And in this, we ask the question of why do some people who experiment with drugs get addicted while others don't? And we went back to this thing where there's this huge normal variability. You have these control people who are very low, and you have cocaine abusers who are very high in dopamine receptors. So it's not like a perfect straight line perfect set of dots that you can plot a straight line through. So we took advantage of this. And we asked if people who had low dopamine receptors would respond to a stimulant drug like Ritalin differently than those with high dopamine receptors. So these are the data. So what we did is we had this data, and we gave them a dose of Ritalin, intravenous Ritalin, which is a very powerful stimulant. And we looked at how they felt. You ask them how they feel, how much they like the drug. And the people who with the low receptors found the drug pleasant. Those with high receptors, it made them feel edgy. They didn't like it. And then there were people who felt nothing. And so if the first time you take a drug or you experience a drug, if it's extremely pleasurable, it's much more likely that you do it again. And so I think we are having evidence now that people with high dopamine receptors are somewhat protected. So environment also plays a role, as I said at the beginning. Now this is a study not done by us, but it's one of my favorite studies. It's a study in monkeys. So you might ask, I show you all of these images, but we really don't have any baseline images. By that I mean we don't know how these brains were before. Did people start out with low dopamine receptors? And because of that, there are some seats here if you want. I see people standing back there. If people start out with low receptors, that make them more vulnerable. So this was a study in monkeys at Bowman Gray University. And they were monkeys that were hooked up so they can lever press for cocaine. And they were housed in single houses. And they all had their dopamine receptors scanned at baseline. So we knew how they started. So what they did was they took them all and they put them in a group. So when they put the monkeys all together in a group, some become the dominant monkeys and some become the subordinate monkeys. And so they let them in there in this situation for 3 months, and then they scanned them again. And during that time, they also measured their intake of cocaine. So this was a really neat study because it just showed that after 3 months, the dominant animal actually got more dopamine receptors. The subordinates stayed the same, and the dominant animal almost completely stopped taking cocaine. So it showed that these dopamine receptor levels, environment really plays an important role. These dopamine receptor levels can change within the time frame of normal social activities. So one of the most effective ways of treating, or one of the really important ways of treating addiction, is to remove the individual, put them in a different social context where they're not exposed to the same cues that cause them to relapse. So we've also been very interested in tobacco smoke. And nicotine itself is another one of these drugs that gets to the brain extremely rapidly. In about 5 minutes, it peaks. And it bathes the brain in nicotine. So this is another example in images that just shows how rapidly these drugs that are smoked get into the brain. Now, we found that when we were doing our imaging studies that there are other sites of action for substances in tobacco smoke. So it turns out your dopamine cell has a binding site for nicotine. So you take a smoke of nicotine, the nicotine comes and binds onto a little place called a receptor on this cell, And what happens is opens up a channel, and then dopamine dumps out and fills the synapse. So what we found that in the cigarette smoke, there are also substances that inhibit these enzymes that break down dopamine. And so this is what the smoker's brain looks like. This is a non-smoker. This is a smoker. And this is a person who's purposefully taking one of these MAO inhibitor drugs. So with this tracer, we were able to see that the enzymes that break down dopamine are inhibited in the smoker's brain. So this was really pretty surprising. It's not nicotine that does this, because former smokers have normal levels of this enzyme. So these are the non-smokers, these are the smokers, these are former smokers. And this is caused not by nicotine, but by other substances that come along with the tobacco smoke. Tobacco smoke we tend to think of as nicotine. Tobacco smoke has thousands of chemicals in it, some of them which inhibit this enzyme. And so we were looking at this, and we didn't know that much about smoking behavior and smoking epidemiology. But one of the things that's pretty impressive about smoking is the comorbidity with mental illness. 44% of all the cigarettes that are smoked in the United States are smoked by individuals with a current psychiatric disorder. And 75% of patients in addiction and mental health programs smoke cigarettes. So not only do they have the mental health problem, but they also have the smoking problem. And it's very difficult to treat, to do smoking cessation in normal, healthy people, but it's even more difficult in patients. And so if you look at the numbers, and we've scanned a lot of addicted people at Brookhaven, we've just had a very few handful of people who weren't also smoking cigarettes. It's impossible to study human addicts without also studying smoker. So in the normal healthy population of the US, about 20% of people smoke. It's down tremendously from what it used to be. But it's very, very country and gender dependent. In China, for example, 67% of the men smoke, 4% of the women. It's more equal in Turkey. The rate is going down pretty rapidly in developed countries, but going up in developing countries. But if you look at alcoholics, almost 90% plus of alcoholics also smoke cigarettes. Other addictions, 90% plus. In schizophrenia, 85% of the people with schizophrenia also smoke cigarettes. And in depression, this is a really interesting one, because this is a group that's really hard to treat, to do smoking cessation on, because frequently they'll have to be hospitalized to prevent them from harming themselves. So there's this hypothesis, it's probably true that smokers may be self-medicating in some of these. Oops. We can maybe turn the light on, so. So, thank you. It's good to have backup equipment. So I was just talking to this gentleman here about nicotine. Nicotine is like the major addictive component of cigarette. It's also what people want in their cigarette, but it's not what's killing them. What's killing people is the carbon monoxide, which comes when you burn tobacco and inhale it, and it inhibits your ability to carry oxygen in your blood cells. And the tars. When you burn tobacco, you get these tars that are full of carcinogens. That causes cancer. So what people want is the nicotine, and it's not basically what's killing them. So I always think of the cigarette is like delivering nicotine with a dirty needle. It's basically it's something that people don't normally think of. So I always, when I see young people who may be starting careers, I like to talk about addiction and public health, and how if there was something we could do about this disease of addiction, we would probably make a bigger impact on public health than anything else we know about. There's a very large prejudice against the addicted person as being morally weak or lacking willpower, but I think what we're learning is that it's a disease. It's a chronic relapsing disease like like many other diseases like diabetes. It's, when you look at heart disease, 35% of all the deaths from heart disease are from smoking. Similarly with cancer, 30%, a third of all the cancer deaths are lung cancer, and they're from smoking. I like to think of these diseases as starting as diseases of the brain. In AIDS and HIV, it's mostly from sharing needles, from intravenous drug use. And if you look at accidents and violence, this normally occurs while people are drinking or they're smoking marijuana. And these accidents occur mostly when there's alcohol on board. So another addiction. In obesity, it's another loss of control. So if you could figure out some way and provide some treatments, this would have a major, major impact on public health. And the challenges involved in developing medication to treat addiction, the major one is stigma. There's a stigma of addiction. People hide it. People don't talk about it. Drug companies don't want to work on drugs to treat addiction because they don't want to be associated with those addicted people. The drug discovery process is very long. It costs about $2.3 billion from the idea of a drug to actually putting it to clinic. There's many failures. There's many regulatory issues on working on controlled substances. So there's a major push to try to interest pharmaceutical companies in developing drugs to treat these devastating diseases. This is a slide from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. This shows the number of deaths. There are about 400,000 that annually die from smoking, from lung cancer, coronary heart disease, chronic pulmonary obstruction, stroke, other cancers, secondhand smoke. And this is the trials on smoking cessation. You have all of this going on because of smoking. And these are the number of clinical trials on treating lung cancer, huge numbers of them, on heart disease, hypertension, COPD, stroke. Look at the number of trials for smoking cessation treatments. Very unbalanced here. There are medications for relapse prevention. There are medications to interfere with the drug's reinforcing effects. There's in various stages. There are vaccines for nicotine that are being developed now, and for cocaine. There are medications to try to beef up the frontal cortex. That's the executive control, the inhibitory control center. There are medications to try to strengthen the interactions between the reward center and the frontal cortex. There's also medications that are trying to interfere with these memories that people have of craving. And there's also a lot of work in teaching people how to overcome, say, can you give people tools that they can grab onto when they have the urge to go back and take the drug? These sort of like biofeedbacks. So there are all kinds of things. As we learn more about what circuits are involved, are there ways that we can develop drugs to treat these and combine it with behavioral therapy to help the person stay off the drugs or to avoid relapses? And so there are some medications that work somewhat well for nicotine addiction. There's the replacement therapies. I don't have the e-cigarette on here, but we were speaking of that. This electronic cigarette, I don't know if anyone in the audience uses them, but it's delivering nicotine cleanly without the tars and without the carbon monoxide. There's research going on these now. There's also, for smoking addiction, there's also bupropion. It's an antidepressant, and it's by realization that people who are smoking and who are having a really hard time stopping may be self-medicating because they're depressed. So bupropion is usually given before the person stops smoking. And there's this new medication called Chantix or varenicline. It's a nicotine agonist, which means it works on the nicotine receptors, and an antagonist at the same time. For alcoholism, there are the disulfirams, which is the pill that makes you sick if you drink. Naltrexone, these are opiate types, and NMDA receptor type drugs. And for opiate addiction, there are like the replacements like methadone and buprenorphine, naloxone, which work reasonably well for heroin abuse. And so this is, I'm just ending here. This is our group at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And in terms of careers in studying science, I think it's a really very rewarding place to end up if you have interest in science, if you like to discover things. This is our group. It's very what we call multidisciplinary. We bring a lot of people together to study these problems like drug addiction. We have all kinds of chemists, organic chemists, inorganic, nuclear, theoretical chemists. We have engineers in our group. We have geneticists. We have physicians, nurses, pharmacologists, psychologists, physicists, and we also have plant biologists because our group has now been switched from studying the brain to studying plants. So our support has come mainly from the NIH over the years and from the Department of Energy over the years that supported the technology for developing isotopes for medicines for scanning. And this is Brookhaven National Laboratory. This is an overview. If you ever fly to Europe and you fly over Long Island about halfway out, Long Island's very long, it's about 60 miles, oh no, it's 120 miles jutting out into the ocean. You fly about halfway out and you see this big scar in the earth. It's a big round circle about 2 or 3 miles around. This is, you can't see this from the air, this is our PET building. And this is called it was relativistic heavy ion collider. It's a big physics experiment, and it was called the Big Bang experiment. And it was designed to tell us more about the events that occurred in the very early universe, right after a few microseconds after the Big Bang, when we had all these quarks and gluons, and there weren't elements at all, and things hadn't come together to make the elements as we know it today. So this was a simulation to try to understand this. So they started out, they basically wanted to collide 2 gold ions into each other. So they started out with a piece of gold foil put in these old-fashioned accelerator called a tandem Van de Graaff. And they accelerated these, they stripped the electrons off these foils and had these gold ions going like crazy underneath the Brookhaven National Laboratory, going through all of these accelerators, getting boosted to higher and higher and higher energy, and then they split them so half of them went counterclockwise and half of the gold ions went clockwise, and they collided them in these various stations. So, and they had these big detectors in there. I'm not a physicist. This is such an incredible experiment. They collided them in these big detectors, and they measured the tracks. And what they learned was something physicists were very pleased about, is that in the early universe, right when everything happened, it was all of these particles were like a perfect liquid. They just sort of went around, they moved around together responding to pressure and moved in a very, apparently very beautiful flow pattern. And so that's what they learned from this. So if you ever fly over Brookhaven Lab, or if you ever come to Brookhaven or out on Long Island, you can visit Brookhaven and probably see this, and it's certainly worth a visit. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Joanna.
And if you...
Time for a few questions?
Yes, please.
You showed some studies on smokers who quit smoking and their dopamine dynamics return to normal or toward normal.
We don't have any. Oh, their monoamine oxidase came back up to normal.
My question is, how about studies on other forms of addiction, like
Yeah.
the alcoholic who hadn't drunk for 20 years,
Yeah.
et cetera?
You know, we started to do some of those in cocaine abusers, but what's very hard, he's asking the question, what happens when people stop taking drugs? Does the brain kind of pop back up to normal? And we've tried to do this with the stimulant abusers, but they basically don't stay off their drug. And if they're out in the wild, you don't know what they're doing. So we did some in methamphetamine abusers there because we studied people from Los Angeles because that doesn't occur on the East Coast in the same way. And so they recovered somewhat. And we knew they were staying off the methamphetamine abuse because they have this thing called drug court. You have clean urines or you go to jail, which is a very powerful motivator for staying off the drug. So there is some evidence that they do recover somewhat. But it's hard to do those experiments because unless you monitor the person all the time, you don't know what they have been doing. Yes?
Dopamine receptors, two questions. How do you lose them, how do you gain them? Do you lose them through the use of the drug, or are you born with fewer? And gaining them, do you gain them by quitting the drug? There was one about the monkeys with Down that you could.
Right, yeah.
How do you lose them?
Well, you lose them as you age, but people are born with either, high or low levels. And I think the drug does cause the number to lower because you can do that experiment in a monkey. You can scan them ahead of time, give them the drug, and then for say 6 months, take them off, let them clear out, and their receptors will go down. So I think it's probably a combination of both.
That's what. How about gaining them?
Gaining them, I mean, there's evidence that exercise and calorie restriction are very good to the brain. There's some evidence that might help the dopamine receptors. So exercise is not only good for the body, exercise is really good for the brain, especially
Social structure will also have some.
and the social structure, like look at the monkeys.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
I mean, the monkey, that's an amazing experiment. And you think of in addiction, you have people that are constantly addicted people, say they're in a neighborhood where that's all they see is drug abuse. The drug is highly available, and it's really hard to break out of something like that because we found that even you can measure changes in dopamine in the human brain by PET in response to cues. So you can show a cocaine abuser a movie of people taking the drugs, and their brain will dump dopamine. And so this is just very powerful because once the brain releases dopamine, say they see their friends or they see the drug dealer, their brain's going to dump dopamine. That is very powerfully motivating. That gets the motor activity going, and it's the go signal. It's the go get that drug. So the environment is really crucial. Yes?
Can you elaborate more on the increase of dopamine and calorie restriction?
Okay, so calorie restriction, if you want an animal to live longer, you restrict calories. And so that's just a general health of the brain. Calorie restriction is generally good for the brain. I don't know about it specifically affecting dopamine receptors, but we know the exercise specifically affects the dopamine receptors. So it's pretty amazing that if you say you have an experiment, your animal only lives for like 4 months, that's a natural lifespan, but you want them to live longer, you want to carry out the experiment longer, you restrict calories.
Let's see if any of the younger members of the audience have a question.
Yeah.
Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I have a question about younger members, could I? What is it about people between the ages of 15 and 21 that particularly makes them more vulnerable to addiction?
The brain is changing a lot. There's a lot of pruning going on with respect to the synapses, and that's the connections between different neurons. So it's changing radically. And it's during development. So she asked what is the going on during that time period. So it's a period of really intense vulnerability. Yes?
So you talked a lot about receptors, but what about increasing dopamine production
Uh, Yeah, I mean, that would also be important. You'd have to increase dopamine cells, try to increase dopamine cells. I don't know how one does that except, say, genetically.
Let's take one more question. Sir?
He's had his hand up for a long time.
Excuse me, with regards to exercise, has there been any research in terms of the types of exercise? Because there's the runner's high.
Oh, right,
where you're
right,
talking
yeah.
about endurance
Yeah.
versus,
In rats, the more complex the exercise, say, I mean, you can have them running a treadmill, but you can then have them doing complex things like balancing on a beam, and that gives an even better looking brain, and a more complex brain synaptically.
and is this at all related to length, the time involved in exercise?
I don't know the answer to that, but exercise is basically a pretty good thing all around.
Was there a question from a student earlier?
Yeah, I was a little bit unsure about where the connection is between schizophrenia and addiction to cigarettes. I mean, I
Oh.
understood the depression thing because
Yeah, right,
of
yeah.
the release of dopamine.
Right. Okay, in schizophrenia, apparently the nicotine helps to gate out interfering things. So in schizophrenia, there's interfering thoughts that come in, that are not real. This helps gate some of these and filter them out, as far as my understanding. So it's another thing. It's, if you taking a cigarette away from someone who really is self-medicating, I always view that as something that's kind of cruel to do. I mean, we basically really need better ways to help the person that wants to smoke, that needs the cigarette. And it may come a point where you're not going to totally eradicate smoking. There's always going to be a subset of people who are just really vulnerable, who need their cigarette.
The very last one.
Okay. So studies have shown that meditation strengthens and thickens the prefrontal cortex.
Mhm.
Therefore, it would seem it would be helpful for
Right,
people who have
right,
addictions.
yeah. People are studying all kinds of things like that, yeah. Yeah, because it's cognitive control. I mean, you have to have just tremendous control to be able to resist something that is so powerful as a substance of abuse when you're addicted. So yes, any kind of cognitive control is really important.
So please join me in thanking Joanna for her.
Thank you.